It must have been around the year 1989, I suppose, that I walked into the Dutch department store Fromm and Dreesman without any plans, really. They were having this huge CD sale at the time. And I remember just browsing through all these different titles and discovering something I'd vaguely heard of before. And it was a CD called A Tribute to Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. And it was priced at 5 guilders at the time, which was so cheap that I instantly just took it away. I remembered I'd heard Tubular Bells, the name, somewhere before, so I just took a chance and bought it, put it on the CD player at home, and I think it didn't leave the CD player for like ages, like for maybe a month or so. And I would listen to it every single night, I think, before going to sleep. And seriously speaking, I think I thought it was so great that I wasn't even interested in finding the original. So this was my go-to version of that album for many, many years. And I found out later only that it was done by one person only, probably. It's credited to the Gino Marinello synthesizer orchestra, but I think it's really just Dutch engineer Reuter who recorded it at home. It's not something we'll discuss today, but my name is Tobias Fischer. I'm a music journalist, and that was my first experience with Mike Oldfield's music, and pretty definitely one of the most important albums in my entire life. And I'm really looking forward to embarking on the journey that this album started in this podcast series with my friend Markus Reuter.
Yeah, I'm Markus Reuter. I'm a musician, composer, producer. My first experience with Mike Oldfield's music was in 1981 or 1982. And my uncle, he had a hi-fi setup, which was set up on a filing cabinet that I still have now, with an interesting door that you can roll up and down. And he had the record player on top of it. And I think I heard 5 Miles Out first, Taurus 2, and side 1 of Tubular Bells. And he gave me a tape of Tubular Bells then. And I was listening to that in the kitchen with my mother. And, very soon, I went to a show with my uncle and my mother in 82 in Essen, Germany. And also the first record I ever bought was Crisis, which was released 40 years ago in 83, right? And it was the 10th anniversary of Tubular Bells. And yeah, today we're starting to talk about all the albums / releases by Mike Oldfield. And even though the one that we're going to talk about today is not the first release, but it's the first release sort of relevant to our discussion, and it's been released as Opus One, basically the demos for Tubular Bells.
There's a beautiful cyclical idea behind this in a way, because it's the most recent release, and it's actually the earliest recorded music we have by Mike, as far as I know.
Yeah, well, not exactly. That was the Sally Angie with his sister, and the Tubular Bells demos, they were recorded 2 to 3 years before the release of the album. Yeah, it's interesting to see how much of the final album had actually already been realized and sort of pre-planned. There's only very few motifs and themes, let's say, that he developed after the demo, interestingly enough. Obviously, it's much more fleshed out, and I guess the studio situation, having co-producers there, was really, really helping a lot. But yes, it's fully formed. Also the themes of side 2, which is really fascinating, because he was must have been 17 when he started doing the demos.
Yes. So I think that's probably taking sort of a journalistic angle. The question to me is it the same piece? I think it's fascinating that we actually have the possibility to listen to this. Obviously, it was part of the big Tubular Box digital set.
2009, yeah.
2009. And so it's not new exactly, but to me, as a fan, it's a dream to read about the existence of it, and then to imagine what it would have sounded like, and then to actually be able to listen to it.
Actually, it was first released as the bonus material to the Tubular Bells 2003 edition. The DVD edition had these demos on it. That was the first time that it was released. So that was 30 years after the release of Tubular Bells, and now it's 50 years after the release of Tubular Bells, and the perspective still has changed. And I remember that hearing these stories that Mike had borrowed the tape machine from Kevin AS and worked on the demo. But as you say, like it's a miracle that these recordings are still like in existence.
So let's maybe dive into those two. I think it's two questions basically. The one is this the same piece? And the other one, maybe even more interesting and slightly more specific, is a claim that at least I read in an article by the producers, is that supposedly the very first demos were individual tunes where there were fade-ins and fade-outs to the pieces, like there were distinct, separate entities. I'm not sure if that is actually true. I don't know if there was a mistake in understanding in that article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but it would be interesting to think about the idea of whether maybe there were demos which had the different themes split into separate smaller pieces. After listening to it again and again, what's your take, Markus? Is this Opus One? Is it the same piece as Tubular Bells essentially?
I think it's the same piece, yes. Coming from the the perspective of the composition, the composition it's the same piece. However, it was the early days of multi-track recording, and the studio, and especially in the hands of Mike Oldfield, became sort of a tool for composition. So the fact that he, fleshed it out, or they fleshed it out in the studio, was part of the compositional process. But you could say it's sort of like an arrangement or an orchestration process. So that's why I would say it is certainly the same piece of music. Like I said, there are some ideas that are still missing or haven't been worked out properly, also in terms of like harmonic progressions and stuff, and the melodies. Like the melodies and especially also the harmonies are so intricate. They needed to be worked out. It's not something that, Mike is a genius. And I'm sure that has heard all these parts in his head even before, sort of like playing them. But with the harmonies and stuff, you really need to sit down and work those out. And that is, the funny thing is, some of that is actually very present on the demo already, but you see that it was done in a much more crude fashion. And that's really where I see the development of the composition. But yes, it is the same piece.
It is, there's a passage in Changeling where he describes being in the studio, I think Abbey Road, and sort of hearing about the Paul McCartney project at the time, and he sort of pops his head and tries to catch a glimpse of what is happening. And it's actually McCartney recording McCartney One, which was an album incredibly ahead of its time, with him recording every single instrument and basically doing what is completely normal today. So I think that could have been an influence, and
I'm sure,
yeah,
yes,
because it put with the idea, but obviously that the technology was slowly getting there. So it would have been very interesting to, like, he had this very simple equipment, and he actually manipulated it so he could record this demo at all. So he actually screwed it open and stuff he'd learned from his father as a little boy.
Yeah. He had to tape over the erase ahead, right?
But it's a nice thought to think what would have happened if he'd only, like, maybe 3 or 4 years later, the technology would probably have been a little bit further, and he would have had maybe a few more tracks available to him. He could have recorded Opus One himself, and it would have been far more stripped down. And the question is, would he have been satisfied with it, or do you think it would have been, like, the final product is more what he had in mind? That is interesting to me, because because I agree, this is the same piece. Almost everything is there. Actually, there's a few passages, I think, in this Opus One which are even more beautiful in this version. Mm-hmm. Around the 14-minute mark, there's this where the organ comes out and it has this sort of dreamy quality. It's almost more beautiful. Yeah. Of course, the finale, that's not fully fleshed out yet. But
however, like, speaking of the finale, so the bass line of the finale, which is really physically so hard to play, the sound, like, it's him playing that there as a 17, maybe 18-year-old, and incredible, like that power,
Yeah.
just the also like the not just the physical power, but really like the need to sit down and do something like that and record something like that. So like the question, like would it have been different if he had better technology, let's say, to record the demo? I don't know. It's quite possible that he would have gone this way, like even without what has happened to him in terms of opportunities, right? So it's really that's sort of like an open question. We don't obviously can't answer that, but I think the way that it panned out, that he actually got the opportunity to record it properly and to have experienced engineers and producers with him. I think that was just a wonderful coincidence for us now, to have this wonderful piece of music.
It's it's obviously like total speculation. Had he recorded it sort of by himself with maybe just a little bit better equipment or more advanced equipment, he would probably have been hailed as a pioneer of home recording. And as it is, he was hailed as a sort of a new master of big classically tinged progressive rock. That's just, there's a huge gap in between there somehow, even though the music is exactly the same.
Yeah, I think, this is a bigger topic. I don't know if and how he's even recognized for what he's doing or what people are saying or really thinking. But I also think that a lot of people do really not understand what he actually was doing. I can only speak from my perspective as a fanboy, obviously, but also as somebody who also sort of like really knows, the music inside out, right? And also like everything around it technically, and also the business side of things. So Tubular Bells really is something extremely special. And listening to Opus One, you can see, okay, you can understand why people say it's simple, right? They experience this music as simple, which it technically isn't.
No.
It's not simple. And in a way, I think this gift that Mike has to write melodies and complicated chord changes and counter melodies and like being self-referential, like to an extreme degree, is so great, because that's why a lot of people sort of also, let's say, you don't have to be an academic to enjoy his music. Quite the opposite. You can be a very simple person and love his music. And I think that is sort of like the big plus that, and also probably also occurs somehow. His music was so successful. If you think about it, like, so Peter Gabriel, for example, as somebody who is kind of like started working at the same time, around the same time, he has sold like, I think 16 million records across his whole catalog. Yeah. And then there's Tubular Bells, which that record alone has sold that amount. Mm-hmm. And so for like Mike's name being still relatively obscure, especially in the US, the impact that his music has had, even if it's sort of like subconscious for a lot of people, is immense. And then like realizing that all of this has already been there in this teenager's mind, who was sort of like, as a sort of escape, sitting in his, well, actually, like, when he was 15, he left school and left home. But like the years before, he must have been sitting there working out all these things. And you know how it goes. Like sometimes people make a demo and they never make the record.
Absolutely.
Or people make the first record and never make the second record. But he kept going. And that's also really what Opus One stands for me is that, yes, you make something, you create something, and you don't stop. So even if it's like everything that has been sort of, how should I say, held back in him for like the first 1.5 decades of his life, let's say, and then that comes out in this first piece of music, it was not, he didn't run dry again, you know. And we know that that happens to a lot of people. There's an urge to express yourself, and something great happens, and then it's hard to follow that up with something else. But for me, as you can see in this progression of the Opus One, Tubular Bells, big success, Hergest Ridge, Omadon, blah, 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 that is really an absolute success story for me.
Yes. To me, I think I'm pretty much on the same page. I think the great thing about having this is seeing what happens in between, or feeling what is happening in between, and then reading about it, obviously, in his own account of that year. But I think 1971, when I think most of the material was conceived, or at least around that year, that was a sort of a searching year for many of the bands around that scene. Like 1972 is the big year in progressive rock. It's it's a very short time where that music comes into fruition and then has its peak, and then to some in 1973 with Tells for Topographic Oceans, it sort of implodes. Not for me, but I know certainly commercially it does for many. And many bands like Genesis, they're sort of searching as well. And I think even Yes, for example, Yes released the Yes album at the beginning of 1971. And that is really a searching album where it's sort of between their old style and their new style. And then 1971 at the end, in November, they released Fragile, which is almost exactly perfection of what they want to do. And I think this searching, there's a lot of searching in that album, a lot of very laser sharp clarity is also in Opus One. Mm-hmm. But I think you can feel sort of the searching for something, and you can almost feel how the music comes into being while you listen to it. Mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly sure about this aspect of searching that you mentioned. Yes, I mean, like, it's I can see the aspect. Well, searching is like, it's finding is what it is. It's not searching.
Yeah, I agree.
That's how I would put it. And it's because, like, okay, let's just imagine how you were when you were 17 years old, right? And you actually sit down and do something like this. You need to also, in the process, you realize which parts of what you have been imagining or working on are not working or don't translate the way that you thought they would. And it's great because, and I've been saying this for a long time, like, recording yourself is sort of like the most important tool you can have as a modern musician to get feedback about what you do, what you sound like. So you can record a solo performance. But if you start multi-tracking and you're recording to yourself, you're forced to learn about orchestration, arrangement on that level, where it's like there's several parts kind of like working with each other. And so even though I hear the aspect that these things weren't fully formed with Opus One, but as I said again, the compositions were there. So it really is the orchestration and the additional arrangement that is the big step between Opus One and Tubular Bells. Also, it's not exactly clear with Opus One if he already knew what was going to go into part 1 and part 2. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the second section in Opus One is the second section in part 2 of Tubular Bells, like Peace. Mm-hmm. It's Peace, I think it's called, the melody, right? So, that section is called Peace, and it's funny. So even though for the most part the sequence of events in Opus One represents the side 1 of Tubular Bells, but then you have demos for, like I said, for Peace and for Piltdown Man, as side 2 of the Opus One album release.
Yes, in that sense, I agree that it's so this claim. I think it was by Tom Newman, but I'm not 100% sure that there exists a demo where the motifs are individual pieces. Yeah. I don't believe that in a sense, because I think the way the piece is written, even though maybe 1 or 2 sections switched around. I think, to me, it's very clear from that this was like it was supposed to have this arch.
I don't know. Like, it was a common technique to splice things together, so it's quite possible that even with the demos, Mike was splicing things together. So they could have been recorded as separate pieces and then put together. I don't know. It's really difficult to tell. Obviously, the sound quality is is okay, actually.
Yeah.
But there you can hear where the tape got broken and and where there are huge dropouts. But it's, like I said, it's a miracle that it even exists. Like the demos for, like, this is something we need to talk about, like the demos for Hergest Ridge and Almadon, they also got released later on. And obviously they are much more fully formed than what we get with Opus One. But you can see that he actually did demos, right? Mm-hmm. So, which is something that, like, would have never occurred to me had I not, I first heard about the Almadon version that got scrapped because the tape fell apart, and that version, we have that now on the deluxe edition, right?
My impression is, when listening to this, is that there is so much taking themes and working with the themes in very subtle ways in the orchestration. It carries on really until the bass line emerges, and then even then, I suppose you can discover sort of thematic material in the later part of that first section. So I think, to me, it's maybe, as you could say, it's the idea was to maybe, it could have been to splice it, but I think this idea of having it being one long piece, that to me is clear that it was.
It's clear. Yes, absolutely clear. And also just in the way that already the thematic development happens. Like, people think of, some people don't understand. They think it's like a collection of separate ideas, but it's not. It's variations on a few themes, right? This is how we can maybe talk about it. And it was fascinating to be reminded that in the documentary, in the Tubular Bells documentary, Mike says something that was really moving to me, where he describes Tubular Bells, and then he says, like, when it gets to the second section, where you have the organ chords rising up to the major version of theme B, right? Anyway, I'm not going to sing it now, but what happens is, like, in Opus One, we actually have the melody, but we only have the minor version, which comes later, which comes much later in the piece. So the major version is not, which is like the big first climax, is not present in Opus One. And here, so what I realize is, okay, so he already must have had these ideas that the themes can exist in different forms, in different tonalities, in different, like major, minor, and also, like, later I learn also, like, the harmonies for the beginning, for the main theme, right? He kept changing them. Sometimes it's Aeolian mode, sometimes it's Dorian mode, and stuff like that. So just to say that he was sort of like purely inspired and intuitional, it doesn't make sense when you look at the way he was varying. So he was very much aware of modal theory, even though if he doesn't have the words for it, but he was using all of that. And back to that first climax. So it's fascinating to see that isn't there in Opus One. At least not in the way that we know it now with the final version of Tubular Bells, but that the minor version of it is fully fleshed out and is even more a song in itself on Opus One than it is on the final record.
So do you think that is because the idea came later as he was working with the material? Do you think it's maybe even because the possibility of using these organ swoops as a way of effortlessly transitioning through different tonalities allowed it for him to make that switch?
It's quite possible. I wouldn't know. It's really that in terms of composition, he's really, like, does amazing things that, again, like, people don't realize. Yeah. So when it goes from the first section, which is all in A minor, right? A minor Aeolian. And then it, we need to talk about, and we'll talk about that much more when we talk about Tubular Bells. But what happens in Tubular Bells is that the first section is A minor, and then the second, the major melody is, I think, F sharp major or something. So very, like, it couldn't be further away, like, and he finds this transition, this beautiful transition, which, as you said, kind of like is supported by that raising, by that major chord on that on that organ. And as a matter of fact, I think that these ideas, they must have been there and then fleshed out in the studio. I don't think that the technology itself inspired the composition in this way, as we may imagine, but you never know. Like I said, I think it's become a compositional tool for him. With the demo, the ability to multi-track basically was the tool to compose. And we don't know for sure, like, how many times he had to repeat something to get it right. Maybe he really had to work it out. Maybe it wasn't totally clear in his mind. But as you say, in Changeling, he kind of hints at how things were for him. And he says that when he was, like, out with his father, the father was a doctor, and, like, Mike had to wait in the car. Mm-hmm. And, he was imagining music that he had heard, and, like, how, like, all the parts and the voices and everything kind of, like, was speaking openly to him. So he basically says that he was very much aware when, like, a melody came in that was a version of another melody, or there was half speed, or like in the basses now rather than in the melodies and stuff like that. And I really do think that there has been sort of like a plan in place from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And, like, Opus One, to me, kind of, like, really totally hints at that. And then, like, realizing that, like, even on side 2, which we only have Peace and Piltdown Man, the demos on Opus One, is that even those are just variations. It's the same melody, the same theme, and it's incredible. Like, it's funny. Like, in a way, you could say that Opus One kind of gives us, say, like, a 95% realization of, like, what he had in mind, which obviously is not true. Yes, and factually is not true. Then there's also just so much more. And this is sort of like, for you as a journalist, you can tell me. So what happened? You said, okay, like, the prog scene or the music scene sort of exploded in those years from 70 to 73 with a lot of, like, key contributions by other musicians. And we should not forget that Mike was already a professional musician, like, from when he was, 10 years old, playing pubs, and then joining Kevin Ayers at the Whole World when he was 15 or something, playing bass, right, initially. And like, we need to mention David Bedford, right? Like, in this Opus One context, David Bedford is already present, even though nobody speaks about him, because he was his bandmate in the Whole World, right?
Yeah. My impression is that in terms of, so the interesting thing about the British prog scene is that many of these bands knew each other. Mm-hmm. And even if they didn't know each other personally, they were very aware of the music other bands were playing. And you can sort of hear the sound gradually coming together, even with obvious, very clear variations, and each band giving their own twist to it. And so I think that's why 1972 is the year for that particular style, because in this year it all comes together. Each band playing to the maximum of their compositional capacities and taking ideas which fit that, like their own interests, from many different parts of the scene. And to me, when I listen to Tubular Bells, and I've really tried to find, like, where could possible points of inspiration have been, I don't see any. It's just, it doesn't seem to take its influence from that. He does mention sort of things he picked up somewhere. There's the track We Did It Again, which he played with Kevin Ayers, which is with the idea of repetition and him coming to grips with this idea. Why would you repeat something which is very simple maybe, and why would you repeat that over and over again? But clearly, I mean, it doesn't, the Tubular Bells opening riff doesn't sound like even the tiniest bit like we did it again.
There's, I mean, we need to mention that there are sort of like additional demos for Tubular Bells that are not on the Opus One record or releases. So there are, as you say, some Kevin Ayers moments where he's exploring already, like this main chord sequence he uses at the for Tubular Bells at the end of side 2, for example, and the bagpipes guitar part, which is actually also on Opus One, with the same band. So it's also the same sequence that he explored with Kevin Ayers already, and there's the Sally Angie record he did with his sister, and in the context of those recordings, he recorded some solo guitar pieces which have some of the Amarok stuff on it, which was Amarok was done in 89 or 90, so like much later, and Omadon, like Sad Song for Rosie, was part of that as well. So you see, like, not only was like Tubular Bells demoed at that time, also like future melodies, future ideas were already present around that time.
Yeah, he's pulling it from from inside himself, I think, more than other influences. I mean, the idea maybe like for a repetitive theme, maybe it's from a Rainbow.
Terry Riley. Yeah.
Terry Riley, and then actually it's more even convincing. The toccata is probably even more convincing in a sort of, because it has the melodic thing if you inverse it, but it doesn't sound like it. It's the idea that matters. So he has this idea, and then it goes through him, and
I mean, in a way, like I think some of us know that he's a real music fan. Like like he never mentioned it, right? Like publicly, it was not that he was a fan of other music and other bands, which obviously, like with being such a maniac, recording your own music, obviously at some point you don't really consume that much other music, but he's a big fan of Pink Floyd. Yeah. And he's been seen at shows all throughout his life. Anyway, like the point I was trying to make is, like, at the beginning of his career, like the influences, they're all there, but he has this very unique take on sort of like a romantic kind of style, let's say, to combine with all those influences he's been having. So he was very clearly aware of contemporary classical music at the time, like maybe via David Bedford, I don't know exactly. He had studied the great, composers writing symphonies and stuff, like he was exposed to that, exposed to rock and roll, exposed to, obviously, the Beatles, like we said, early Pink Floyd.
Jazz, I mean, Centipede.
Yes, it's exactly. Septober Energy.
Yeah.
Right? And all these things. And he played with Robert Wyatt.
Yeah.
Right? Robert Wyatt was the drummer with Kevin Ayers for a while. So he really kind of like was in the, how do you say, in the middle of all of these intense developments in music. And that's, and prog was just one influence. Like we also know that he's a King Crimson fan, right? So, but do you hear King Crimson in Mike's music?
No.
Not at that point, right? Like later, maybe there's a little bit of that somewhere. It can be found somewhere. But this unique vision to a really okay. So I need to go back to something I didn't. So when he talks about in the documentary, when he talks about the beginning of Tubular Bells, so section A going in section B, like the A minor to the F sharp major, he calls it. He says, and then comes this incredibly beautiful melody. So he talks about his music as if it isn't his, right? And he does that in a way that gives me goosebumps still. It's so convincing how he says that. Like, so that's how he is thinking about that. Doesn't really see himself as the originator, but he enjoys that he has discovered this, right? And that's because he points out that particular thing about Tubular Bells, and at the same time we see, okay, that is not in the demo. I find that fascinating. So we see that like on the process of discovery, he finds things that define moments for him, like even if he hasn't really planned it out before.
And I guess maybe that's also why this piece is so dear to him, because as someone who was so, at the time, so, can I say afraid of reality? He actually says music was more real to him than reality because reality was so scary.
Yeah.
Maybe the thought that in this place he would be taken by the hand and led to beautiful to beautiful things. Maybe that must have played a part in that. That what was coming out was actually beautiful and meaningful.
Yeah, the family background, let's say, plays a big role there, and but also the fact that he had these like one experience with LSD. I don't know if you remember that. He also writes about that in the book, and he basically says he got so scared because everything appeared so mechanical to him in that state. Maybe I'm just paraphrasing it in the wrong way here, but as a matter of fact, it seems to me as if there is something in that experience that probably made him like realize even more how important it is to kind of like to bring his humanity into what he was doing. Like I think he was always doing that, but somehow an experience like that where you see like you could be mechanical about things or you could be technical about things, and then realizing like, okay, he doesn't do that. And the funny thing is that by doing something or creating something as amazing as Tubular Bells, it was like maybe like incredibly technical. So just the last section on Tubular Bells, before the Sailor's Hornpipe, right? Like his guitar playing is incredibly technical, and this. But again, sort of like coming also from this idea that he's playing two guitars that talk to each other, that play with each other. So the technicality aspect, let's say, in terms of playing and strength and dexterity and all of these things, it's all present in what he does. But at the same time, like the emotional aspect of the music is always first.
Yeah.
And that is really, to me, like sort of like an encapsulation of what makes his music so great, because it offers something for everyone, and even as a musicologist, you can find things that you wouldn't believe somebody would do. The finale in Opus One, it's already there, it's already present. And actually, funnily enough, it's the bass line, and now we can like nerding out a little bit here. The bass line, which is in a Dorian scale, and it's simply shifting it up and down. So it starts as an E Dorian, F sharp Dorian, and then A Dorian. Okay, so what happens on top, and in Opus One, it's even more pronounced. The chord that is played over the E Dorian is an E mixolydian chord, so an E major chord over an E minor bass line, and it's fascinating because like if you take away the movement of the parts, the lines, it's incredibly dissonant. But the way that he has sort of like laid out the notes in time, you get this incredible, like, it is bluesy in a way. It's bluesy. It's always a combination of major and minor, and like when the pattern, the bass pattern moves up to F sharp. Actually, the F sharp is not the bass note, but B natural is the bass note, which on the real Tubular Bells you can hear that played with an organ bass, right? It's just so intricate. Like everything is so incredibly intricate, and then you have like at the end of I think it's again like the finale theme is a 10-bar phrase, I think, maybe, or 12. I can't remember now. It's so funny that it's like the A suspended 4 chord, and then da da, right, da da. So the suspension to that super obvious sort of major, and you still have the bass line in minor underneath, and so it's just so special, and rich and sort of fearless, but always with that emotional romanticism as a big part of it.
Mm.
And at that time already, like, people were not so keen on doing that anymore. Like, the minimalists were doing that in their way by staying within the field of the pattern, let's say, which is the simplified pattern. And then you have groups like Yes, for example, where you have these romantic kind of like developing themes and stuff. But in general, it was already getting a little bit unpopular.
Maybe it would be interesting. Do you play the bass as well?
I do, yes. Yeah.
So what would interest me is, from your perspective, when I watched the live performance of Tubular Bells, one of the early ones at the BBC, I didn't know this, but he's actually playing the bass in that concert. And he didn't actually play the bass at all before he started playing with Kevin Ayers. So he picked it up very quickly. Now I'm bilingual, so I speak Dutch and German as my mother tongue, and also English. I learned that pretty early on. So when I take on a different language, and the thing is for bilinguals very often, when you speak in one of the languages, you will sound to a native speaker to someone else, but you're never really a native speaker in either tongue usually. So it's always influenced by the other one as well. And you take on a different personality, but it's always mixed. And I wonder if you can hear, maybe, do you think it matters that he was so natural in so many different instruments, that in his guitar playing, in his bass playing, he actually says, I wanted to play the bass almost like a melodic instrument, or more like a guitar maybe. And then his most famous theme is actually on the piano. And I wonder if this complete openness you can hear that in his different performances in instruments, but also maybe, as you said, in his harmonic language, because you would, like, different instruments can do different things, and some things which are very unnatural in one instrument are completely accepted on another instrument and work on another instrument. Like even the fact that you're playing something fretless makes a huge difference. There are quarter tone instruments and so forth. Do you think that this harmonic language, as you described, is maybe part of this completely natural ability to just pick up an instrument and play with it?
I don't think it can ever be completely natural to anybody to just pick up an instrument and play it. But I agree with you. If your main interest is the music itself, right? Then you serve the music somehow, and you like, I think also in the autobiography it talks about there's an aunt that has a piano and he plays on the piano and he has this experience of making sounds with different kinds of instruments. So the guitar is the one that he's most proficient in because he was just playing it a lot, and he had that folk influence, and he learned the fingerstyle guitar and all of that, which was very important also for his electric playing later and stuff, right? But I think if your focus is the music, you just create the sound world, you just try things, right? And it's always been fascinating to me to kind of like realize, for example, Punkadiddle on Platinum, which is like a funny tune there, that these themes, he played them on acoustic guitar with fingerstyle, with accompaniment and melodies. So things that are kind of like, we know them completely out of context of like how he first kind of came up with the melodies. So that's why we don't really know, has he really started like the main riff, Tubular Bells, on the piano, or maybe it wasn't. We don't really know.
There are sort of, he does claim in Changeling that it was sitting down and playing on the piano. But I agree.
Yeah.
Who knows what came before actually committing to it on. Yeah.
Yeah, like I already mentioned, like, we're talking about Opus One, right? So the demo for Tubular Bells. So on, I think, the Incantations deluxe edition, there is a piece called Piano Improvisation, which is a demo again, but it's a demo for, believe it or not, Platinum and Guilty, a piano improvisation. It's called improvisation, it's not an improvisation, right? But it's the themes are there. So, and again, played and recorded with an instrument that has nothing to do with the end result. And that's why, in a way, Opus One has sort of like is even more important, because you can see he already had some idea about the orchestration. So it was really more decided on the form it would gonna go in, and also, I mean, you know, like some really unique things that he's been sort of like, from my perspective, sort of like exploring over his career by like combining triplets with binary rhythms, for example. It's already present in the very first section of Tubular Bells. These things that like, people don't talk about this, you know, they maybe talk about that it's in 15/8 and stuff like that, but then realizing that under the 15/8 you have the bass line which has a triplet, right? So it's really incredible that these elements are already there. The demo already carries the main features, not only for Tubular Bells, you know, the Opus One for Tubular Bells, but also for most of, well, or a big chunk of his career.
At least the early trilogy or maybe quadrilogy of releases, there's lots of...
Yes, but funnily enough, we don't have any songs there.
No.
So we got into that later.
Maybe, I mean, Incantations has the second movement has. Sort of,
yeah, but I mean, there's vocals, but there's not a song form.
No, it's
that's what I mean.
Like, yeah.
Yes, yeah, it is no song form. But then, you know, like there was, you know, like Don Alfonso and stuff like that they did us for fun, which sort of like hints at, you know, that there could possibly be a songwriter in there as well. Mm-hmm. But we'll get to all that, right?
Just how intricate it is, maybe that's a nice anecdote, is that I played you my CD, which I bought in 1989, as I said, which has stayed with me, of this one person paying tribute to Oldfield by recording a note by note.
Well, more or less
note by note performance. I'm going to call it a digital performance of Tubular Bells. I still think it's pretty well done, but to a degree. But then at the very beginning, when the bass comes in, you instantly notice that it's actually in the wrong. Like it comes in at the wrong moment, and so it's rhythmically wrong.
Yes.
Which is fascinating. I mean, there's also, I mean. This would have been something much easier to fix in I don't know, it was, I think, recorded in 1987. In the mid-80s, but it would have been much easier to fix this than it would have been for Mike Oldfield to fix it, all these things when he was recording Tubular Bells. But I would assume that it just didn't get noticed.
Yeah.
So there is something, the intricacy and what you say people don't notice, I think it's because it is not complex in any way that it's trying to be complex. There is.
You know what? Even though I'm not sure about that, I think he's trying to be clever.
Do you think so?
Yeah. Not trying because he succeeds. You know, like he's not trying. But it's incredible to see how the interrelatedness of the themes is pretty much there. You are absolutely right. It's not for the sake of being clever, but still it is clever. It's sort of like the ideal state.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there's one thing what I like about Opus One is that you can, in some parts, you can really hear that even more clearly. So maybe that's the great thing about the later recording is that it, because it is more rich in texture, more dense, is that some of these things blend more, and then it turns into like you can listen to the sound of it, and you would have to more actively search for it. But I notice on many passages, one thing he does quite often, I think that's typical for him, is he's not only introducing a theme and then using it later on in the piece, but he's actually introducing it in like instrumental sections before it actually arrives. So he's actually introducing it on a subtle and on a subconscious level.
Yes.
I think that is clever.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel that maybe it's because I know this piece so well. Maybe, I don't know what it would have been felt like if I had listened to it later. And I just never had the idea that I had to work on liking it. You know, where there's this music which you have to, sometimes it can pay off listening to something, you're intrigued by it, but you don't quite understand it.
Yeah.
This was never the case with Tubular Bells, and I realized only later how intricate it is and how much is happening harmonically. And when you watch him play it, or when you watch a group of players perform it, there is a lot going on. There's so much going on, and there's so much, as you said, dexterity that's required of the performer.
Yeah.
It just doesn't feel that way when I listen to it. Maybe because I don't play the instrument, I don't play a guitar, and I don't play a bass.
Yeah, it's sort of like an effortlessness to it. Exactly, and it's part of the gift, you know, that like Mike and his surroundings sort of like had.
Yeah.
You know, to make something like this beautiful and light-hearted and serious, you know, like it's everything at the same time somehow. And that's why, like, coming back to the idea of the influences, right? It's like we just said that there is no song, really, no song form, but then the Piltdown Man is sort of like a joke, somewhat on a song form, right? And we don't really know if, like the story goes, that the voice was put on after he's gotten like rejected by the companies. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, he's not a trustworthy narrator, I suppose, in some respects.
Yes. I mean, like I say, it has the voice, but like you hear it. It's the lead part, right? It's like when it's the same melody is present just 2 sections before it comes on the record. So that's why, you know, the live version on Exposed of side 2 is so beautiful, because the Piltdown Man voice actually is played with strings. The melody is played with the strings. And it's fascinating. It's incredible. And we'll get to all that. Like, there was one more thing I wanted to say, that you were saying that in Opus One, like, some of the things are more obvious, right? Like the ideas or what's actually happening is more obvious. Kind of true. If we look at the demo for Omadon, for example, you realize that he like all the themes used in Omadon, they are supposed to work. They can all happen at the same time. They can coincide, and they can be in canon with themselves. So the intro of the demo of Omadon has all that in it, but then it's stripped down for the original version. You know, you can see. So there's, in terms of like the concept, there's even more there in the demo phase, and then he kind of comes to his senses and says, okay, no, I don't need to show people that I can do all this. You know, I can, you know, but I don't. And that's somewhat different still with Opus One going to Tubular Bells, because he's kind of like starting out to realize that he can, you know.
Yeah. And
then the album is the realization of that. And then I think actually Hooker's Ridge is a good example. If you listen to the demo and the final record, it's basically the same. Yeah. Composition is pretty much formed, and it just got re-recorded.
Yeah, no, I agree. When I was looking for possible like similarities in the music scene at the time, I mean, there's actually, as I said, I don't think there's anything really. I mean, in terms of every single record, which is sometimes named in the context of this one, is just a rock band expanding the barriers of rock, which is not what this is. So I suppose the only thing we should mention, you've mentioned Pink Floyd's Atom Heart Mother. That is the first side. That is the only piece which is remotely like in concept, but then even then there's no real similarity. Mm-hmm. And when I listen to Tubular Bells, the more I listen to it, I think when I listen to the way the sound of it and the way many of the compositions flow, it has this the Celtic folk thing seems to be closest. But then obviously it has a different harmonic language, and it has all these other influences which go into it. And in a way, I think Opus One has even less of that. This idea of Celtic, that seems to be something which came in through the instrumentation, maybe. Opus One, I feel, is maybe Mike at his purest. That's why I'm so grateful it exists, because it places the piece more in its time than Tubular Bells. Tubular Bells is, I think, far more timeless than Opus One. Opus One, recording technology, the performance, it's more in its time. But the great thing is that it seems to be even more of him in a way. I can imagine him sitting there as he describes it in this little room, writing these themes and then weaving it into something incredible.
There's even bluesy stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So the triplety kind of like bluesy thing that like there's the Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho kind of melody, right? Which in Opus One is even more pronounced and repeated much more than on the final version of Tubular Bells. Because I'm just mentioning that again because I think we forgot to mention this influence, right? The blues guitar.
That's true.
Very funny because like people would say that if there's one guy who can't play the blues, it's Mike Oldfield. But I totally disagree. Like there is a solo, the solos he plays with Kevin Ayers, like incredibly bluesy, and kind of in a very particular way. And so emotional that like when the solo starts, the whole music gets transformed.
Yes.
And that is sort of what is so special about it when he's working on it and doing his own music. You don't get that effect so much. That obviously, like anything that he introduces instrumentally or musically, kind of like gives a lift or gives a change to the music. But it's not like it feels like something that exists in a different universe. But when he plays with other people, that's sort of like what sometimes happened. He plays a note, like you hear the band sounds huge, Mike plays one note, and suddenly the band sounds small. That's sort of like the experience I have with his tone and with his kind of playing. So it stands out so much and changes the surroundings. It's literally like, it's really like one note that he plays for me is like the purest expression of art. Because like it changes everything around it, Or it was particular kind of art. Let's say there's other art that does other things, but and in his own work, that sort of is more relative. It's not that strong, and that's what's kind of cool. And maybe that's also the reason why he kind of like was not so much a collaborator, with the exception of like working with David Bedford a lot, right? Yes. But like if you realize, okay, for what I'm doing, like it really needs to the context needs to be my own stuff for it to work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah, it's good that you bring up the blues, I guess, because I listen to Yes and Steve Howe, and there's a sort of, I've always thought there was in many passages there's a sort of a similarity in sound, a sort of an overlap, and then even another guitarist where I sometimes hear it is Kirk Hammett in his late 80s phase. And I was wondering, would Kirk Hammett be listening to Mike Oldfield? I doubt it. So where's this coming from? So maybe it's the blues. Maybe that's one thing I know. Certainly Steve Howe was very much into it. So
I have kind of like some just recently gotten some more fascinating info about Mike Oldfield, like because I talked to Ant Glynn, the guitarist who played with him in '83, and just explained to me that Mike was actually a real fan of blues rock, and Ant played a tour with Midnight Flyer, I think was the band, opening for AC/DC, and so Mike actually saw bands like Midnight Flyer, but also AC/DC, and he kind of like, so was pretty much always kind of like connected to the scene where you would never really see these connections, but he was a big fan of music in general, and it's like it's fascinating to me because then like looking back, something like the theme, the bluesy themes in Opus One sort of like start making more sense. If you look at at that kind of, that perspective, things we only kind of figured out later about him, things that he never really talked about himself. Right. So which music, I think like there's only one article that I know of where he talks about music that he likes and listens to. And there was like, only one I remember was that In the Court of the Crimson King was actually part of his top 5 or something. Incredible.
That is interesting. Yes, I didn't know that either.
Yeah. And his choice of vocalist for on a strange record like Earth Moving, he had Adrian Belew, right? And he had Adrian Belew not just because of his singing, because Adrian was in King Crimson.
Yeah.
Right? And Michael likes Discipline, that record. And also I know that Mike even also approached Robert Fripp to play on Tubular Bells 2 and stuff like that. So there's a lot of little details of information that like people don't know or wouldn't believe. Then this story that he got contacted by Michael Jackson is actually true. It was in around 84, 83, 84. I don't know which record that would have been.
I think he does mention it, yeah. That would have been for sort of a collaboration.
Yeah. So, and like, to me, it doesn't come as a surprise, because if you're a musician and you have some sort of like exposure to Mike Oldfield's music, there's your, for lack of a better term, there's your God. It's sort of like, that's what I was saying. Like there's like a certain, the context. Mike always made the context, created the context for himself, which also means that he created context for others. In a sense, like a context that was not like readily available to a lot of human beings.
Yes.
Right. Like if you want to be creative, you want to play in a band, and you're in America, let's say. You're so kind of drawn into the tradition, into the rock and roll, into the blues, that it's pretty difficult to kind of like emancipate yourself from those influences, right? And so some sort of, and this is sort of what Opus One kind of hints at, that in a way it's sort of an expression of not going with what was going on.
Yeah, that's my impression as well. Yeah.
So it requires a lot of courage and self-esteem in a way. Funny, kind of like, because he would probably say he was very insecure, and he says that, like he was certainly very insecure back then. But in terms of the musical vision, the artistic vision, like, okay, no compromise. Oh.
I wanted to ask you also a question about what I'd be curious in the middle the section where the bass part starts. Mm-hmm. He talks about it a lot, and he says it was really hard to perform because it had to be one take for it to work, and it was physically demanding, and it was almost like his fingers were bleeding. Mm-hmm. But of course, this section it didn't have to be that long. Like purely on paper, you could have just made it a lot shorter, but no. It isn't short. And I remember very distinctly that when I listened to this, the very first month of listening to this record, that was the magical moment for me. The incredible patience mm-hmm. that is in this section, and the suspense and the tension of until the melody actually arrives. And that is also in Opus One already. So
okay, I mean, I can be a smart ass here.
No, be a smart ass. I want to ask you, is there, talk about Opus One, and then what I really love to know, do you think there is, because I was almost, it almost hit me like a shock when each time again when the voice announces the first instrument.
Yeah.
Is there a logic to this? Do you think, or is it just purely instinct that dictated the length of this passage?
Okay, I already said that the finale section, the famous, like with the introduction of the instruments and stuff, that is the most harmonically adventurous section of the whole of Opus One and Tubular Bells. It is crazy.
That's interesting.
It is crazy. It's super dissonant. If you play these chords on the piano, the melody with the chords on the piano, it sounds wrong. It sounds completely wrong. In Opus One, like right at the beginning of the bass riff, which he plays beautifully in Opus One actually already, he has puts the major chord on top right away. So it takes away from the surprise that it actually is major and not minor. in the studio in Tubular Bells, this is more disguised. It's quieter and it's not the full major chord from the very beginning. And so what I think is happening is that the repetition of that bass riff makes us kind of feel very comfortable with that sound and kind of like takes the harmonic information out of the equation somehow, because it's repeating it so many times that when something else happens that could be dissonant, right? The bass line has already become its own entity, and it kind of like loses the power to change to be, you know, to change the harmonic content of what's happening on top.
That's a good point.
And it's an effect, or like this accumulative effect, let's say. I have started to understand that and use that in my compositions as well, where you basically present something as if it's correct, as if it's consonant, you could say. You present it that way, and and then you introduce something that is not consonant with what it's already happened. But since you have presented it with such a conviction, let's say, it then works. And I think that's what's happening here. So the bass line is repeated so many times so that it really becomes an ostinato, a drone almost. It's a drone. And it's the drone of E, F sharp over B, right? And then to A. And it's that progression, just of the root notes, that's what kind of like remains in people's heads. And then comes the major melody major, but right? So it's a bluesy scale on that. Yeah, because da, 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 da. So it's the flat seven going to the root, and it's just incredible. And so I think, and even though this may not have been consciously done this way, but that's sort of like what's happening. So you introduce the theme, you wait, and then you add something. And actually, the very beginning of Tubular Bells, you have the theme just on piano. And then all the other instruments come in after like 5 repeats or something like that. Also here to note, like it's not 4 or 6 or 8 or 7. I mean, or it could have been 7 or 5. It's like the repeats are also not. It's not an even number, so like you're surprised when it comes in, and then it's harmonized. Then that theme is harmonized, and so and you get before the harmonization happens, you don't have the full picture, because you're missing one of the 7 notes. Timing, let's say, is a very, very important part in his music, and has always been. Like when you watch him, like live performances, and the band plays at the wrong tempo, you can see his face, like, oh my God, you know, like he's so aware of, like, okay, if we guys play this just 3 BPM too fast, it's not going to have the impact. It's like completely losing the impact and stuff like that. I know, I mean, I say I know that that's really the case, because I can see it in his expressions. And you can also tell, yeah, it just doesn't work as well as if it was slightly slower, you know? And again, like all these tempo changes, everything's already there in Opus One. And it's, like, we don't know, as we said, we don't know if it's spliced or whatever, or if there was a plan, or if he's written down the BPMs, or we don't know that, you know, but it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. And it's interesting also if you compare it to the Montreux version, which he played later, which is actually, probably that would have been the version that Richard Branson would have hoped for, like with a band and actually in the mood of a rock idiom. I think it takes someone for him to make that work. I don't think anyone else could have just played that.
Yeah, and such a small band. It was 6 people.
Yeah.
Right at that point, and like the first tour he did was 55 people. That was, you know, so, and that's a wonderful version, and that's sort of like a jazz rock version, you could say, which is wonderful and incredibly well recorded as well, and spliced together from several shows. But yeah, you can kind of like see all of these things happen in a relatively short time frame. So Opus One, then maybe at the most 2-3 years, sort of like, and we have the fully fleshed piece, right?
Yep.
And then at first, there was no. He didn't want to tour. He did like two. I think there were two performances.
Yeah, one which
the BBC and then and there's actually a recording of the live premiere somewhere.
There are definitely problems.
Yes. Yeah. So, but people went nuts, Still, yes. So, I don't know. And then, like 5 years later, there was the Exposed tour in '79. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also, I think, a beautiful example for music which works best for people when they don't come in with any expectations, because I think he talks about the process of trying to find a deal based on Opus One demo. And there is so much resistance against, I think, the idea of doing it and doing something like that. But then it gets its American breakthrough when it's just a few seconds of it are played. Okay, let's say a minute of it is played in The Exorcist. It's not the soundtrack to The Exorcist, never has been, but it's still vitally important in a way because it sets the tone of that movie. But it's in the background and it's set to build pictures, and people are not actually coming in expecting, okay, this has to be rock music, this has to be classical music. They experience the music as it is, and then it suddenly takes you in completely. I think that's also a sign of how different it is from anything else, and in a degree even from his own work, that it makes it somehow.
Yeah, totally. Like when the opening theme, like the Exorcist theme, like you could. For me, it has nothing to do with a minimal piece of, like a minimal composer would have done, because again, yes, it's a pattern, but it's a melodic pattern. It has like the main feature is his melody, and that is also quite possibly why it became such an iconic device that then found its way into culture. Like, in everybody does it. If you want to have something like suspenseful, before this little piano tinkering, let's say, right? There was Bernard Herrmann doing scary music, and it was completely different. Yes. And then suddenly you have this glockenspiel and piano combination, and people start, using that device in film music, and in whatever, like adverts, sound logos that what was it? Was it Intel?
Yes.
It's the first four notes. No.
Oh, that was Telecom. That was actually.
That was Telecom. But in the Intel logo, sound logo, is the first four notes, and it's it's a cultural phenomenon. If we talk about Opus One as the demos that you go and shop around, I can understand that people maybe didn't understand it. Okay, maybe it's the first section that has sort of like the flavor that it would have had when recorded properly. The rest obviously has a very different flavor. It's much more naive, but not naive compositionally or musically, but in terms of like what he could accomplish in terms of recording it himself. So just being given the opportunity to record part one first, and then there was like a break and then part one was done like in a week, I think, and then part two was done in like 3 or 4 weeks or something like that, but with a longish break in between. That is sort of is a gift to us all that it happened that way.
And while you were telling all this, I think one thing about the Opus One demo is also that there is less dynamics in that one. There's so much more dynamic in the finished piece. And one thing which makes the finished piece so interesting is that some of the most prominent instruments on Tubular Bells are instruments which would usually be in the background and hardly in the foreground, which is quintessential to recording as a medium, because as microphones were becoming better and better, you would actually pick up like voices which would only have worked in a very small space. The intimacy of those voices could be translated to a completely different, like much wider soundstage. So you could have a very intimate voice over a large orchestra playing. And he's using that very effectively, both in Tubular Bells and Hergestrich, with the Glockenspiel and with the, obviously the Tubular Bells as well, which he actually, even on the recorded medium, could hardly get loud enough to get the desired result. And that is sort of missing from Opus One still. I think the Opus One doesn't have this...
The dynamic range.
The dynamic range and this idea of small instruments sort of taking the place that a singer would take.
Yes.
In a more traditional pop song or jazz song.
Yeah. And funnily enough, there's another like version kind of Tubular Bells, which is the Music of the Spheres, which he did 2005 or around that time. And there it's also the closed miking that makes that work, whereas the harp is the lead instrument in an orchestra, which hardly ever works. Unless it's amplified. And you're right. And that's kind of goes back to what I was saying, that the recording studio became a big part of the compositional process and the arrangement process, because you could only present that sort of balance in a recorded medium. And that was also one of the arguments he had for not performing live, because it was difficult to get these balances in a live performance. So that's why like the first attempt with the big orchestra, big band, and then like the band got smaller to 10 people, then 6 people, and there was always ways to kind of like rearrange it for a different ensemble, like some more successful, some less successful, you could say, but always fascinating. And I guess the experience of recording the demo and then seeing what can come out of the demo must have been incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
And then having the opportunity to have some money, like he said, it was still pocket money he got after the release of Tubular Bells, but he was able to ask for a studio to be installed so that he could start working on Hergestrich at home as a recluse, So Opus One actually is nice because it sort of like hints and gives us basically most of the things that he would later explore in bigger forms.
We haven't, I think we've talked about an hour now. We still haven't touched the one thing which probably would have made sense to start with. The main thing, of course, with Opus One as a demo to Tubular Bells is that it doesn't include the Tubular Bells. Yet. And there's not even the thought of including Tubular Bells, at least not concretely. We can, of course, speculate on whether something like the melody going through different colors was there at some point. We don't know. It isn't mentioned in Changeling. As you mentioned, he hasn't spoken about it. I know many, I don't know many people, but I've read on many forum contributions, many people saying, I love Tubular Bells, but I've never really liked the inclusion of a speaker who announces the instruments. That's, of course, the big thing, which that would probably mean that they would have preferred Opus One, because it doesn't include Viv Stanshall yet. I'll give you my opinion and then I'll be curious to hear yours. I've always thought that without Viv Stanshall, maybe even really him, but any human presence in there, I don't think the album would probably have taken off the way it did. At least on a long-term basis. After the Exorcist would have worked, but to me, this piece starts off with as something which is very much in the tradition of this, as you said, romanticism, absolute music. It isn't classical music; it's its own thing, but it stands in this tradition. And he's mentioned Sibelius as a concrete inspiration, not an influence. I don't think so, but an inspiration. So we know he loved romantic composing and that style. And so it starts off with that and it goes through all these variations of the theme. And then suddenly it goes into this bass, as you said, this hypnotic bass, and it takes you even deeper. Even though it's a break, and it should somehow cause a break. No, it actually takes you even deeper into this state. And I feel that suddenly there is the emergence of the voice. It includes something which is even like it's it's outside of this world and he takes it in. He makes something which you can instantly relate to, the human voice, and he includes it in something which is on this remote, ideal level, which only music, I think, can take you to. Really, that's what makes music so different from all the other forms. And he takes it in, and he doesn't actually tell a story with it. He just lets the voice introduce the instruments. Even thinking about it, it moves me. When I hear it, and it moves me thinking about it, that he's able to make. And also he said, I hated being asked why. And I think one of the reasons is that this is music which precisely you cannot pinpoint the why. Mm-hmm. But there is a meaning in it, and you feel the meaning, but you cannot access it. And I think that is ultimately, it makes us aware of how small we are as human beings in the greater sense of things. Even if you're not spiritual, you will recognize how small, infinitely small you are compared to the universe. And I feel, not taking it too far, but that's what I feel when Viv Stanshall comes in.
Yes, it's absolute genius idea to do that. As you said, like the voice of Viv Stanshall is also, the way it sits on top of the music is sort of like, it's huge. Like it's sort of like some sort of massive ceremonies, but actually sort of like okay, so the repetitive bass line, like where do we have that in classical music? It's Ravel's Bolero, which is sort of like famous for that, and you have the same theme going over and over, orchestrated differently. So it's really very similar, right? The same idea, and around that time, you had Leonard Bernstein making his talks about music, like where the orchestra was playing, and then he would stop the orchestra and would explain, would say, "Oboes, can you play this part?" And so it was almost like an educational aspect. That's something that was around back then, where you could make people aware of what's happening, and the voice introducing the instruments is almost like it takes the, as you say, the human voice, the iconic sound of the human voice, and places that within an instrumental composition, along with the production, where the panning of the instruments is kind of, so they start in the middle and then they move to the sides, and then you get the next instrument. And so stereo equipment. There's also on Tubular Bells the famous note about can only be played on the stereo equipment and stuff like that. So it's a genius thing that happened. Peter and the Wolf, for example, as sort of like an orchestral Prokofiev, an orchestral piece with narration, which sort of like also speaks to children, right? So it's sort of like the voice speaks to a very deep part within us, and it's just I think it really is literally genius. Yeah. Like that happened, that Viv Stanshall was available to do that, and that it also has the comedy factor, like, so it's funny. Yes, pronounces the words in a funny way, and so it's taking something very serious and very emotional, something you could make you cry, and we know that Mike's music makes people cry, and gives that certain touch of lightness and relief somehow. And again, like the demo for Omadon, like the finale of Omadon, in the demo there is a voice on top of it, right? So again, that's why I think, even though maybe in Opus One and then Tubular Bells, it wasn't planned that it would go that way, but once it happened, I think he and they knew what incredible thing they had discovered.
I think to me it's the representation of someone who lives in the music. I think there's probably, if you don't like it, you're seeing it sort of as is, sort of. You're looking at someone just telling you which instrument is coming in, and then the instrument comes in, and then you have the educational thing. And that is there, but I think, to me, the whole piece has this movement, even though it is made up of different sections, which may or may not have been at one point different sections, like different pieces, but it has this flow and it goes to this moment, and then the announcement, Tubular Bells. And so it is moving towards this moment. And then just the tubular bells come in, but it doesn't have meaning in the sense as a pointe in a story house. It just doesn't have, but it has meaning in the sense that only someone who is really deeply invested into that music can understand. It hits you, but it's but on the surface, it's really just what it is. It's the tubular bells coming in. So there's this sort of a conflict, I think, with your conscious brain and your emotional one, and the result is something deeply moving. It's sort of a contradiction. Maybe it's sort of the clash of the harmonies, as you mentioned. Here's a clash between something that is sort of trivial and something comical, and at the same time it's sad and rousing and thrilling, and it has everything that his life was going towards in that sense as well. So it's
I mean, there's something very, very beautiful about the moment that the tubular bell comes in, because the acoustic guitar, so the fingerstyle guitars that play sort of like arpeggios, they get introduced a little earlier and they're already in the mix. And when the tubular bell comes in, the arrangement changes and the voices come in and they sing a counter melody, like, which is new chords, slightly new chords. Like there's a chord melody happening underneath that iconic melody then, and everything then fades out to be that ending, you know, which then at the very end is the beginning theme, but in major, with the major chord at the end. And it just gives me goosebumps just thinking about it.
Yeah, it took me a while to recognize. When you recognize it, it's even more incredible.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And just sort of and then, you know, going from that A minor at the beginning to the E major, so like musicologists would say starts with a tonic and ends on the dominant, right? It's just such a genius thing. Like really, you could say you couldn't really plan it that way, but somehow it was planned that way, with lots of, you know, creative angles, let's say, that happened in between, but there was a plan for sure.
As you're also a musician, do you think the fact that this had to be played, like the bass section had to be played physically and often in one takes, you think that impacts the effect the music has? That it's, I mean, he's the struggle
of playing, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. Like you can feel the tension. And it's very much been sort of like part of his sound, is the I've never met the guy, but he must have been incredibly powerful, like strong person. I talked to a guy who was working at Virgin in the 80s, and he was friends with Mike, and he said that Mike always wanted to go play squash or tennis with him. And so that Mike was really extremely physical as a person, we're looking at, he's like rather like not a tall guy, right? But he must have had like lots of energy, and it speaks through the music, because like, I mean, what does strength really? How does strength show itself to the outside? Ideally, it could be seen as somebody's very tense. Or like with the art, with the music, you can hear it as effortlessness, right? And that's sort of like what's happening there. You have both like the tension and the aggression, and at the same time the authority. Authority is a good word, and that's what it kind of transports, you know, authority.
Yeah.
Okay, is that enough for the first?
How many hours are we going to talk about Tubular Bells, I guess? I wonder, but,
I mean, we're already talking about it.
Yeah.
But it's good to see, you know, how much there is.
Yes.
So thanks everybody for listening to this. This is just the beginning of an ongoing series of podcasts on Mike Oldfield. The next one will be on Tubular Bells.
Finally Tubular Bells.